Hello, this is Jim Schaefer, executive producer and host of Rip Rap, the academic book television program. My guest today is Juan. We'll be discussing his latest book, Engaging the Muslim World. Welcome to Rip Rap, Juan.
Thanks for having me, Jim.
This is a real pleasure to have you on the program for a second time because your careful and thorough informed scholarship in the Middle East, known widely for its depth and breadth, has served for me and many scholars as a kind of tonic or antidote from the more simplistic notions that have muddied the waters in understanding the dynamics of what has been and is taking place in the volatile region of the world. As you point out in this book, Engaging the Muslim World, that very misinformation has evoked what you call Islam anxiety, at a point where you claim the Muslim world and the West are at a standoff. Perhaps you explain what you mean and why.
Well, it's from both sides, really, but there's been opinion polling in the United States that alarms me in the amount of bigotry that it is displaying. Over 2/3 of Americans openly admit that they're prejudiced against Muslims. And over 50% say they don't trust American Muslims to be loyal to their country. A quarter of Americans say they don't want to live next to a Muslim. I mean, these are attitudes that we had hoped to leave behind with regard to ethnic groups in the United States with the civil rights movement 40 years ago. It's horrible that there's been a recrudescence of this kind of open bigotry, really towards an ethnic group. It's a religious group, but it's also, I think, in American terms, ethnic. On the other side, you get all kinds of conspiracy theories about the United States in the Muslim world, in the Middle East. Large numbers of Muslims say they're convinced the United States wants to convert them to Christianity, wipe out Islam, or divide and rule. Pakistanis are worried. They are more worried about the United States and its deleterious impact on Pakistan than they are about India, their traditional enemy. So the opinion polling is actually quite alarming and disturbing, and it's one of the reasons that I wrote the book.
When the whole concept of misinformation really gets in the way of engaging what you talk about as a true dialogue. And the misinformation is just incredible, what each side thinks the other is doing and why, and the implications of it.
Yes, there are mistaken conceptions, and then I think there's deliberate distortions, again, on all sides. So I think, you have some evangelical preachers maintaining that the Quran instructs Muslims to kill non-Muslims. In fact, murder is forbidden in the Quran, as it is in all holy books. And a place is made in Muslim societies for non-Muslims to have their property and their lives respected. One can argue about the politics of those arrangements, but the idea that the Quran is somehow, a homicide instruction manual, which is what some elements in the American right are purveying, simply, just false. It's untrue, and likewise, not true that the United States government is interested in converting the Muslims to another religion. I mean, these things are being said to scare people.
As I reflected on all this, a key word to me was demonization, which is a malicious distortion. And certainly as more fragments of truth comes out from the whole war on Iraq by the United States, demonization seems almost a deliberate policy, that they needed to have this enemy and to make it a fierce, irrational, vicious enemy. And that really is quite distressing.
Well, I talk in the book, there's a chapter on Iraq about how Islam anxiety, which grew out to some extent of the September 11th attacks, was displaced onto Iraq in a quite unfair and invidious way. So the Iraqi government was more or less a secular Arab nationalist government. Back in the 70s, Saddam Hussein was notorious for opposing the people who wanted to make Islam the state religion in the Iraqi constitution. He insisted that no, the Ba'ath Party ideology is a secular nationalist one. So to imply that Saddam Hussein was behind al-Qaeda, that he was training al-Qaeda agents, and all these sorts of false allegations that were made or hinted at very broadly by high officials of the Bush administration was frankly dishonest. And I believe that they knew that it was dishonest. That is to say, they were lying.
Well, as more evidence is coming out, that's becoming clearer and clearer that, you know, like the weapons of mass destruction as being the main excuse just never existed except in some frivolous and essentially libelous or whatever is just lies, you
Yes.
know, about what was going on. But I felt that that's the other thing that has been disturbing is not only was there a malicious thing as far as the reason for the war, but then the exploitation and the profiteering that's gone on like Halliburton. It's just been incredible.
Well, the U.S. Government's policy of privatization, of having private firms do things for the U.S. government that the bureaucracy used to do for itself, has made the government an enormous source of clientelage, and it is corrupt often. You've got these guys who serve in a government bureaucracy for a few years, they retire young, then they get out and form a services company aimed at supplying things to the unit that they used to work for. So they'll be calling up their buddies and then they'll throw the contracts to them and so forth. And of course, under the Bush administration, a lot of these bids were let with no competition. They were just given out like goodies.
Well, and you have the examples of soldiers being electrocuted in their showers because of shoddy workmanship. Now, there's all kinds of things that are coming out, but that whole thing. The other thing, as I reflected on this, is the relative state of ignorance of so many young people who then go into the military and they have no basis for intercultural interaction. They don't know who Muslims are or who Arabs are or anything, but they do have these stereotypes that they have heard in the media, and then they go there, and there's some vicious things with that, which then reflects, you know, in Iraq and Afghanistan. So,
yeah, certainly it's the case that, and you could see it in 2003, that some of the military units were, you know, Christian soldiers, and there have been cases of evangelization and of religious competition with their Muslim peers. But I have to say that it is my perception that the U.S. military has been trying to get up to speed on the cultural issues. They are starting to train soldiers more in language and culture. They are doing more public reconstruction work, and so they actually sometimes doing the kind of tasks that the Peace Corps used to do, which you can't do without cultural understanding. So I think, you know, the U.S. military has been given a lot of things to do in the last 8 years, but it is, the officers are trying to get up to speed on the cultural things.
well, let's go back to this concept you talk about engagement. What do you mean by that, and how can it work in this particular situation?
Well, you know, the Bush administration was determined to simply ignore and crush anyone who disagreed with it in a serious way. And so they had a series of bilateral disagreements with Iran, and they refused to talk to Iran for the most part. Towards the end, they began to change their minds a little bit about talking to Iran about mutual American and Iranian security concerns in Iraq, and a couple of meetings were held on that. It was a kind of militant ostrich policy, put your head in the sand and then adopt a jujitsu pose, was really the approach of the Bushies. And I'm arguing that that's a poor excuse for policy. If you've got problems with Iran, you got to talk to them about their problems. And you may not make immediate progress. It's not something that actually was hidden from the former administration. That is to say, when he was head of Halliburton, Dick Cheney, later vice president under Bush, gave a speech in Malaysia in which he said that it would be important to talk to Iran. And he said it may take 10 years, but I think we can bring them in from the cold. So a lot of the things that he was saying of a hardline nature a few years later were posturing. It wasn't what he actually thought. It wasn't what he thought would be good for his company when he was the head of a company. Why does he think it would be good for a government when he's the head of the government or the next best thing? So I'm arguing that dialogue is important. I'm not saying that the United States should lift sanctions on Iran. There are certain kinds of sanctions that I think are human rights abuses, are unhelpful, and so forth. But I don't deny that certain kinds of tough approaches may be needed. And I don't characterize them as carrots and sticks because we're not dealing with a donkey here. We're dealing with other human beings. But it is true that you want to put pressure on Iran about certain of its behaviors, and you, on the other hand, want to ensure that they understand that there will be things in it for them if they desist and come back into the world community. So it's not an argument for a soft approach, but it is an argument that you get no place with the militant ostrich posture.
Well, and the big elephant in the room is the oil. And that, as I reflected on it, can also distort the engagement process. If you come in and you just want that, and you're going to do whatever you got to do to get that, that's not really true engagement to me. True engagement means you've done your research and understood the cultural and the political and economic realities that the person or country that you're dealing with is facing. And that's what I thought was really great about your book, is because you lay out a number of places where there are stereotypical perceptions about what's going on, and then there's reality, and one of them was the brotherhood.
Right, right. Well, I do have a chapter in the book about petroleum, and I make an argument that it is hydrocarbon energy resources, petroleum and natural gas, drive a lot of U.S. policy towards the Muslim world. It is important for the U.S. to have access to that energy until we go green, and that's probably a few decades off. On the other hand, the idea that you can just take the oil, that it actually belongs to us anyway, and usurp it, which I think was in the minds of some people in Washington, turns out not to be true, because petroleum and natural gas are exported by people from populated areas, and the pipelines and the harbors are in populated areas. And so there's a human security environment in which hydrocarbon production takes place. And basically, if people there don't want you to have their gasoline, you won't have it. The pipeline from the northern oil center of Kirkuk in Iraq went through Turkey to the Mediterranean. It went through Sunni Arab territory. It is controlled by the Kurds at the moment, but it went through Sunni Arab territory to get to Turkey. And the Sunni Arab tribespeople who were opposed to the new American hegemony over their country and the ascendancy of the Shiites and the Kurds just kept blowing it up. At one point they counted there were 2,000 holes in that pipeline. you're not going to pump a lot of petroleum with 2,000 holes in your pipeline. So the kind of Cheney militant grasping for these resources that the United States wants from the Muslim world backfires. Indeed, you know, down the road, there may come a point at which there's a competition of a peaceful sort between the United States and China for a bid, and Iran or Iraq are going to throw it to China just because they don't like the way we treated them. I don't think the kind of new mercantilism or the use of the federal government to grab these resources for private corporations is going to work out very well.
Well, you talk about this temptation to meddle, you know, including political military intervention and the coup thing and harsh rhetoric and demonization and neo-mercantilism. You know, it just can't leave it alone. You know, it's all kind of stuff from the side instead of dealing with it straight up. But that's the other thing that fascinated me, and as I reflected on this, is that for some reason, I think it's perhaps because we don't have a nuanced view of the Arab world and the different countries there, is that it seems to me what we have is a rather simplistic idea. We don't understand the complexity of the geography of the region, of the economies, of ethnic groupings, including the Kurds and all that. And so we think we have these very unrealistic ideas of what can be done.
Yes, well, I mean, it's certainly true that a lot of the analysts you see on television or people at think tanks or people high in the government are woefully misinformed about the realities of the Middle East. And you have to stop and think that, you know, most Americans don't have very much of a direct contact with the rest of the world. 2/3 of Americans don't have a passport. Even people who do have some expertise in international affairs, it's usually Western Europe that they know about, maybe Central America, maybe Japan, but it's limited in some way. And even, you know, Condi Rice, who was the National Security Advisor and then the Secretary of State, is an old Soviet hand. And I don't think she started out knowing very much about the Middle East at all. In fact, during the height of the Israeli attack on Lebanon in 2006, Condi went to Beirut in an attempt to negotiate. But she went there not very long after President Bush had told the Israelis essentially not to yield to a ceasefire too soon. So she showed up in Beirut soon after Bush said that to try to do some negotiation, and people there just refused to see her. I mean, she was humiliated. She was in Beirut without an appointment, and she had to go back. But, I mean, the Bush administration seemed to think that you could just run roughshod over people's honor in the Middle East and still get them to play ball with you. And I don't know actually any place that would work, but it certainly doesn't work in the Middle East where people's honor means quite a lot to them.
And they have very long memories.
Yes, well, it goes with being, if honor means a lot to you, then, you know, grudges and feuds and long memories come with that.
I often tell people, when people are still upset over the Crusades,
yes, well, yes.
they're certainly going to regard the Iraq incursion and remember it. You know, it's a terrible thing. You talk about this concept of industrialized democracies and that whole issue of democracy in that part of the world. And President Bush often said, well, we're going to help, you know, Iraq become a democracy. And that just seems similarly simplistic, you know, and falls short. You have to have the culture. You have to have the foundation if you're going to have a democracy of any sort.
Yeah, well, my recollection is that the previous administration only began talking about democracy in Iraq after everything else had fallen apart. So I don't think it was their primary focus. And to tell you the truth again, I think it's another piece of dishonesty. I mean, I think they wanted an excuse for militarism. And just nowadays in the contemporary world, just declaring you're going to fall upon another country, conquer it, and occupy it, is a war crime. So they needed some highfalutin, ethical-sounding excuse to do what they wanted to do, and they trotted out this Wilsonian language about democratization. But I don't see any evidence that it was sincere on their parts. Remember, before the Iraq War, then Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld said that we needed something like democracy in Iraq. And I thought to myself, well, what does he mean by that? I mean, isn't democracy kind of like being pregnant? Either you have it or you die. It's a dictatorship or it's a democracy. Yeah. It was something like democracy. Made me think he wasn't very into the whole thing. And then I argue that it was the Shiite spiritual leader, Grand Ayatollah Ali Sistani, who more or less forced the Bush administration into allowing one person, one vote open elections in Iraq in 2005 by putting tens of thousands of people in the streets protesting that the Americans promised them democracy, so where was it? So I think the Bush administration had it in its mind that it could fix the elections, or it could restrict the electorate in some strange way, and produce results that it wanted while talking this way. And ironically enough, they were hoisted on their own petard because the Grand Ayatollah in Najaf heard them talking about democracy and took them seriously and pushed them into it.
One of the things you discussed in your book is the difference between Muslim activism and Muslim radicalism, and I think that's a very important point to discuss.
Sure. Well, again, Americans, and you can understand it a little bit in the wake of September 11th, which was a horrible thing, and 3,000 people died in it. But it was done by a far-right fringe of the Muslim world, and that's become increasingly clear over time. In the immediate aftermath of September 11th, a lot of people had doubts as to how big and important this movement was that had pulled off this major attack. But as time went on, it's increasingly clear there's no there there. At one point, they were saying Al-Qaeda is organized in 60 countries. But if you look at it carefully, yeah, it was like 3 guys in Singapore and 4 guys in Thailand, and it was 60 countries, but it's like almost nobody in each one. An impression was created in a lot of people's minds of Muslims out of that event, which has gone on informing their views. And so anybody in the Muslim world, like the Muslim Brotherhood or in Egypt or the Jamaat-e-Islami in Pakistan, who advocates for a Muslim society, is seen as somehow a terrorist. And I'm just making the point that while people who want to impose their religious views on other people and maybe their religious laws on other people, whether the other people like it or not, might be annoying, there may be objections that could be raised to their political ideology. It's not the same as terrorism. Terrorism is the deployment of violence against civilians by non-state actors for political purposes. And these groups, on the whole and for the most part, are activists. They often participate in parliamentary elections. They have members in the country's legislatures in Egypt and Pakistan. They're activists, but they're not terrorists. And treating them as terrorists is, first of all, it's unfair and probably a violation of international law. But it's also extremely unhelpful, because if you treat somebody as a terrorist and mistreat them and so forth, then you marginalize them, and ultimately you may produce the effect you're trying to avoid.
Which is something that's really troubling, and you point that out in your book. If you do that, you're creating terrorists, if you're persecuting people. And there's that other thing of, well, what about Tim McVeigh in Oklahoma City and the guy who just, shot the doctor and all that? What is that?
Yeah, well, I argue in the book, and this is this argument gets a hard ride in the United States because Americans just can't see it. But we have a radical fringe ourselves of people who frankly have a lot of racism and hatred towards people who are not like them. And at some points in our history, that fringe has amounted to something politically. I mean, it's now forgotten that the Ku Klux Klan won Indiana, in the 20s, and Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols, who blew up the Murrah Federal building in Oklahoma City in the mid-90s, are always talked about as if they're two lone nuts. But in fact, we know, I mean, the journalists have looked into their background. They were part of a network of gun enthusiasts, and not that there's anything wrong with being a gun enthusiast, but I mean people who make it into a cult and who are violent about it, and of white supremacists and religious fundamentalists and so forth. And McVeigh and Nichols had hung out with people in all of those kinds of communities. So it's not a movement. It's a little vague, but it is a network. And they came out of that network. It wasn't just a one-off thing.
Yeah, I don't think they walked out of their house one day and decided they can make a bomb out of fertilizer.
No,
no. They had to get the information somewhere, and
oh yeah, and besides which, the motivation. So they were taking revenge for the federal government's crackdown on people they admired at Ruby Ridge and Waco. They had a whole litany of tyrannical acts that the federal government had committed against the right-wing fringes in the United States, and so they were taking revenge for that. I mean, as somebody who reads both kind of literature, the kinds of things they say strike me as very much like Al-Qaeda. In fact, they dreamed of striking at Washington, D.C. and all those sorts of things that Al-Qaeda did, and they also had conspiracy theories about Jews dominating the world and so forth. So the discourse of the far right in the United States and the far right in the Muslim world is very similar. And people say, well, it's much more of a movement in the Middle East than it is in the United States. But at the height of the militia movement in the mid-1990s, 12% of Americans in polls said that they supported the militias. I mean, this is not a small thing. And it alarmed me when I heard that statistic. I put it in the book.
Well, thank you for appearing on Rip Rap. Your scholarship really is pretty difficult. I mean, because of the bias of the media, because of the bias of a lot of people who should know better, it's difficult to understand what's really going on, and I think your book and your other books have provided a fairly closely nuanced look at something that's being painted with a broad brush. So thank you for appearing on Rip Rap.
You're very welcome. Thanks for having me, Jim.